Okay. Good morning, good evening, everyone. Welcome to this eighth and last session of the Latin American, Caribbean, Southeast Asia High-Level Academic Dialogue Forum. This is our third session on economics issues. Of course, we have a great panel, and I thank you all being here today. Having said that, I will just a little give the floor to Professor Vinicius and Mesa. I will introduce Professor Mesa. He is a researcher at the Center for Economic and Policy and Sustainable Development, CIMPE, of the National University of Costa Rica, Foro de Costa Rica. Professor Mesa, the floor is yours.
Okay, yo haré mi presentación en español y muchas gracias, profesor Ramoneda, por permitirme exponer en este espacio. Voy a hablar en este espacio sobre las cadenas de valor y es parte del trabajo que estamos tratando de desarrollar en Centroamérica con el tema de lo que tiene que ver con los temas de cadenas de valor. Estamos tratando de hacer digamos, un trabajo que contribuya necesariamente a establecer claramente cuál es ese valor agregado que estamos generando en la región centroamericana y específicamente en Costa Rica con respecto a lo que se está haciendo en la ASEAN, más específicamente en los países que integran el sudeste asiático. Cuando nosotros vemos digamos, el esquema de las cadenas de valor en el sudeste asiático, estos son datos el Eora Database de ASEAN sobre el Global Value Chains en esa región. Y en términos generales, lo que nosotros estamos viendo es que del crecimiento de las exportaciones que se hacen en la región del sudeste asiático, y esto lo voy a tomar como base para posteriormente hablar de lo que sucede en Costa Rica, estamos viendo que cerca del 64% de lo que se produce en la región, digamos, es parte del valor agregado doméstico de las empresas domésticas que ahí, digamos, están desarrollando. Y es bien importante porque al final, cuando nosotros vemos, por ejemplo, dónde se está concentrando el porcentaje, ¿verdad? El mayor porcentaje, por ejemplo, de valor agregado extranjero en las exportaciones por industria, vemos también que el tema de los vehículos o de vehículos de motor y otros equipos de transporte son los que más están generando el valor agregado dentro de ese porcentaje de la industria, específicamente en la parte de manufactura y dentro del sector terciario que tiene que ver con la parte de servicios, necesariamente tiene que ver con todo el tema de administración pública y defensa. Es decir, ahí vamos viendo cómo las actividades en términos de valor agregado, digamos, podemos ver esa estructura. Posteriormente, cuando nosotros hacemos una revisión, ¿verdad? De cuánto significa, ¿verdad? Desde el punto de vista de la estructura de valor agregado de las exportaciones desde la ASEAN por país, nosotros estamos entendiendo, por ejemplo, que, y esto es bien importante, por ejemplo, el 58% del sector terciario en Singapur casi que es digamos, el más importante. En el caso de Singapur, el tema de servicios es el que está necesariamente moviendo la economía singapurense y necesariamente, por ejemplo, en el caso de Brunei Darussalam, ¿verdad? El 60% lo está moviendo el sector terciario que tiene que ver con servicios. Es decir, esta es la forma en la que nosotros podríamos entender, por ejemplo, cómo el valor agregado de las exportaciones desde la ASEAN por país, digamos, tienen una alta concentración en algunas de la mayoría de los países, a excepción de Malasia, por ejemplo, que tienen una gran cantidad de valor agregado en el sector terciario. Cuando vemos, y voy a ir a pasar rápido para contar la parte centroamericana y el caso de Costa Rica, cuando nosotros vemos la evolución del valor agregado de las exportaciones desde la ASEAN, vea que la evolución, por ejemplo, en el caso de la región del sudeste asiático, nosotros estamos entendiendo, por ejemplo, que de 1990 al 2018, el crecimiento del valor agregado doméstico, ¿verdad? Que es sumamente diferente a lo que sucede en la región centroamericana, y eso es parte de los desafíos que nosotros tenemos que tener, casi que lo están generando las mismas economías desde el punto de vista de su esquema de las micro, pequeñas y medianas empresas, y es un valor agregado súper importante que está dado necesariamente por el sector empresarial doméstico de estas economías. Y eso necesariamente lo que está indicando es que efectivamente, a diferencia de lo que está pasando en la región centroamericana, el crecimiento doméstico es fundamental en las cadenas de valor. Y vean, por ejemplo, que cuando nosotros vemos el color rojo, lo que nosotros estamos entendiendo es el valor agregado que se genera en los países de la ASEAN, ¿verdad? Que es considerable, es decir, de hecho hay un modelo gravitacional alrededor de las economías de la ASEAN, y esto necesariamente está permitiendo que dentro del mismo modelo económico comercial que se está generando en esa región, ahí necesariamente se está generando también un importante crecimiento del valor agregado de las exportaciones de estos países. Y por ejemplo, cuando vemos aquí que el resto del mundo se ha mantenido constante, ¿verdad? En términos de ceteris paribus, y ha contribuido necesariamente en ese valor agregado. ¿Qué pasa con el tema de la cadena global de valor y la participación por los miembros de los países? Por ejemplo, es interesantísimo porque desde el punto de vista del Foreign Value Added, ¿verdad? O el valor agregado foráneo, ¿verdad? Nosotros lo que tenemos es que Singapur, ¿verdad? Es el país que más valor agregado foráneo está generando dentro de su cadena de valor, y tiene una lógica, sobre todo porque contribuye con el puerto, ¿verdad? En términos de servicios y todo digamos, en términos de la estructura financiera y venta de servicios, es casi que un hecho que la cadena de valor o la cadena global de valor de Singapur tenga esta característica. Y es muy diferente, por ejemplo, ¿verdad? En Laos, y es muy diferente, por ejemplo, en Indonesia, en el mismo Brunei, y por ejemplo, en el caso de Myanmar, que es casi que es digamos, una cadena de valor sumamente doméstica. ¿Qué tenemos aquí entonces? Dentro de la industria de automóviles, ¿verdad? Esto es parte también del informe del Centro Japonés de Investigación con datos de Eura Database de ASEAN y de la UNTAC. Y véanlo, lo importante en términos de la industria automovilística. Por ejemplo, cuando nosotros vemos a Malasia, a Tailandia, nosotros tenemos que el valor agregado doméstico en la producción de industrias automovilísticas en Malasia difiere con respecto a Tailandia, y es que en el caso de Malasia, los automóviles, ¿verdad? Muchos de los Perodúa, por ejemplo, y de los automóviles locales, necesariamente estamos viendo que es parte de esa dinámica. Hay un micrófono en silencio. Sorry. Ok, thank you. Ok, entonces lo que estamos viendo es que necesariamente tenemos en Malasia una gran, digamos, valor agregado interno, mientras que en el caso de Tailandia la producción de vehículos, digamos, provenientes especialmente de Japón, que es una industria externa. En el caso de los electrónicos, también vemos que Malasia, y esto es, en los electrónicos, Malasia es un país que agrega muchísimo valor, y la evolución ha sido constante en términos del valor agregado que estos países tienen, a diferencia de Filipinas y Tailandia, ¿verdad? Que también en términos de electrónico ha sido un país que ha tenido muchísima participación, mucho más que Malasia en algún momento, y obviamente más que Filipinas. De hecho, Tailandia, con el esquema de Intel desde hace muchos años, ha logrado posicionarse dentro de esa cadena de valor de electrónicos. En ropa y textiles, ¿verdad? Es lógico, de hecho tenemos una gran digamos, un traslado importante de la ropa y textiles, especialmente de los algodones, hacia Camboya, Myanmar y Vietnam. Y en el caso de Camboya ha sido uno de los principales países que más valor agregado generan en la cadena de valor de textiles. Actualmente ha ocupado en los últimos años uno de los procesos más importantes en este proceso de la cadena de valor, y eso necesariamente también lo posiciona en ese espacio. Y en el tema de agronegocios, Indonesia, ¿verdad?, es uno de los países que más valor agregado generan en este esquema de la cadena de valor de la parte de los agronegocios. ¿Qué tenemos en el caso de Centroamérica? Y en un estudio realizado por el Banco Central de Costa Rica y el Departamento de Estadística de Macroeconomía, que es parte, digamos, de lo que hemos estado tratando de resolver, ¿qué tenemos? Y entonces resulta que cuando nosotros vemos las exportaciones de Centroamérica hacia la ASEAN y viceversa, ¿verdad? Y de las exportaciones de la ASEAN hacia Centroamérica, nosotros lo que estamos teniendo claro es que desde Centroamérica nosotros estamos vendiendo mucho café, mucho té, mucha yerba mate, muchas especies, estamos vendiendo muchísimo azúcar y confitería, estamos vendiendo muchísima chatarra en términos de fundición, hierro y acero, estamos vendiendo muchas frutas y frutos comestibles, ¿verdad? De muy bajo valor agregado, ¿verdad? Pero estamos importando, o desde la ASEAN nos están exportando vehículos y automóviles, ¿verdad? Obviamente tractores, velocípedos y demás, nos están exportando máquinas y aparatos y artefactos, nos están exportando muchísimos productos, barcos y artefactos flotantes, nos están exportando muchísimo plástico y manufacturas. Es decir, efectivamente, desde el punto de vista de la reconsideración y de la reconceptualización de las cadenas de valor, nos pone a pensar que en este momento, desde el punto de vista de la pospandemia, nosotros tenemos que empezar a reconsiderar el escenario centroamericano con respecto al escenario de la ASEAN. Es un bonito escenario para poder empezar a reconceptualizar qué es lo que estamos haciendo en la región centroamericana, y deberíamos de entender que en un proceso pospandémico, post-COVID, como lo estamos viviendo actualmente, nosotros estamos en muchos problemas, sobre todo porque estamos en un espacio de la cadena de valor muy débil, con muy bajo valor agregado, y que efectivamente eso nos pone a nosotros en la región a sufrir muchísimo en estos momentos cuando nosotros realmente ocupamos dinamizar la economía. Y es que efectivamente cuando uno ve qué es lo que está pasando en estos dos escenarios de lo que estamos exportando y de lo que la ASEAN nos exporta a nosotros, definitivamente nos estamos dando cuenta que nuestros productos son productos de muy bajo valor agregado, y los productos que tenemos desde la región de la ASEAN son productos que tienen un mayor valor agregado. Y, por ejemplo, vean que el valor total de los productos para el año 2020 fueron de casi cerca de 983 millones de dólares, comparado con 197 millones de dólares que exportamos nosotros hacia la ASEAN. Es decir, es casi 4 o 5 veces más el valor total de las exportaciones que nos hizo la ASEAN a nosotros con respecto al valor total de las exportaciones que nosotros hicimos para esa región. ¿Y qué pasa con Costa Rica? No me voy a detener mucho digamos, porque tenemos el tiempo muy limitado, pero ¿qué pasa con Costa Rica desde el punto de vista de la cadena de valor y en la parte de servicios? Fíjense que cuando nosotros vemos los datos de Costa Rica dentro de las cadenas globales de valor, a diferencia, por ejemplo, de los países asiáticos que tienen un alto porcentaje de la participación doméstica de las empresas locales, de las micro, pequeñas y medianas empresas dentro de la cadena de valor, nosotros lo que tenemos es que el casi 87% de la participación de las empresas en la cadena de valor de servicios están en un régimen especial. Es decir, son empresas que están posicionadas en una zona franca y que necesariamente no son de capital costarricense, y en la mayoría de los países centroamericanos es la misma condición. Es decir, nosotros no estamos produciendo necesariamente el porcentaje del crecimiento doméstico, de la participación en la construcción de un servicio o un bien no estamos participando con el grueso de empresas domésticas, sino que lo que estamos haciendo es, bajo un régimen especial de una zona franca, estamos participando dentro de esas cadenas globales de valor, pero con empresas necesariamente provenientes de otros países. Y lo vemos en este caso, ¿verdad? Ya lo vamos a ver. Otra cosa, por ejemplo, y aquí está clarísimo, la participación extranjera, ¿verdad? Del valor bruto de la producción por la cadena global de valor de servicios. Imagínense que la participación extranjera es el 81.4% de esa participación extranjera es la que está elaborando nuestro proceso de valor en el país. A diferencia de las economías asiáticas y el modelo asiático, que el mayor porcentaje son las empresas domésticas de capital local, ¿verdad?, de los países, y en el caso de Costa Rica, más bien es al revés, es la participación extranjera con un 81.4% de la producción del valor producido, bruto producido por la cadena global de servicios. Fíjense que acá nosotros tenemos el gráfico de la sonrisa invertida, ¿verdad? Es decir, ¿qué es lo que estamos haciendo nosotros con el caso de la participación del valor agregado en la cadena global de valor de servicios? Estamos con una sonrisa invertida, es decir, no estamos haciendo necesariamente donde más recursos y valor agregado se está dejando en temas de servicios, sino que estamos trabajando en los extremos del gráfico de la sonrisa, y es donde menor valor se genera necesariamente. ¿Por qué? Porque los servicios de informática, los servicios de consultoría en gestión financiera y las actividades de investigación son realizadas por este 81.4% de las empresas que están ubicadas en un régimen especial, no necesariamente en un régimen definitivo local, y esto necesariamente lo que está haciendo es que la cadena de valor de servicios está en su concentración y donde más recursos se pueden generar en manos de empresas extranjeras. Por eso es que podemos tener en estos gráficos una ilusión óptica necesariamente de qué es lo que estamos entendiendo en Centroamérica y específicamente en Costa Rica sobre lo que es una cadena de valor y necesariamente cuál es la participación de las empresas locales domésticas de capital local dentro de esa dinámica de esas cadenas de valor. Y ojo con estos datos reveladores del estudio. El 42.5% del capital de las empresas que están ubicadas en un régimen especial, que son las que están moviendo la dinámica o son las que dinamizan las cadenas de valor de servicios, es estadounidense. Y el resto, ¿verdad? Vean que solo un 9.8% de ese total es generado por alguna empresa local, ¿verdad? Costarricense, pero el resto es capital extranjero. Es decir, cuando nosotros hablamos de la cadena de valor de servicios en Costa Rica, nosotros lo que estamos entendiendo es que apenas un 9.8% de lo que se produce de valor agregado en el país está en manos de alguna empresa de capital doméstico, pero el resto y en un alto porcentaje en manos de empresas estadounidenses ubicadas en un régimen especial, y eso necesariamente es, digamos, muy bueno para la economía, porque en cierta forma dinamiza esa economía y esa integración a las cadenas de valor, pero es una ilusión óptica en términos de qué estamos entendiendo por cadena de valor en este caso. Cuando hablamos de la cadena de valor de manufactura, es la misma situación, porque al final lo que tenemos es que el 81.1% del total de las empresas que participan dentro de la cadena de valor específicamente de implementos médicos, instrumentos electrónicos, etcétera, y que vendemos muchos de estos instrumentos médicos o de estos insumos médicos y electrónicos, en el caso de Malasia, por ejemplo, si vemos los datos, este dato creció del 2016 al 2017 en casi un 6% y se ubica actualmente en un 81.1% al momento de la medición que hicimos. Es decir, cerca del 82%, y podríamos estar hablando ahora más porque han venido más empresas al régimen especial, cerca de un 83% de lo que se produce de valor agregado en la cadena global de valor de manufactura está en manos de empresas internacionales. Y otra vez, dentro de ese régimen especial de la cadena global de valor en términos de manufactura, está también dado y dinamizado por muchísimo capital de Estados Unidos, cerca del 48%, y vean ustedes que ya en este caso Costa Rica no aparece dentro de esas empresas que brindan capital en manufactura. Es decir, si en servicios nosotros teníamos por lo menos un 9,8% de ese total en ese régimen especial, en manufactura ni siquiera aparecemos con algún porcentaje, ¿verdad?, de ese régimen especial para la creación de valor en manufactura. Es decir, estamos fuera de la cadena de valor de manufactura y son empresas internacionales de capital de otros países los que producen esta cadena de valor. Conclusiones, retos, desafíos que yo veo en esta dinámica. Bueno, uno de los principales retos, y yo quisiera dejar en evidencia en este foro académico, y quería hacer algo cortito pero sustancioso, que me parece que es un tema en deuda en la región centroamericana. Ese es un desafío que tenemos en la región centroamericana por muchas razones, por falta de recursos, por la fortaleza de líneas de investigación, digamos, desde la academia para entrar en esta dinámica de investigación, en tratar de calcular los datos de las cadenas globales de valor en la región centroamericana, cómo se están dinamizando estas cadenas de valor en la región centroamericana, por qué están ubicadas estas cadenas en la región centroamericana. Están ubicadas necesariamente porque están aprovechando las condiciones del recurso humano capacitado y de las condiciones de inversión necesariamente que las economías están generando, o necesariamente están aprovechando únicamente el régimen especial donde están localizadas, y eso les permite tener en cierta forma un nivel de competitividad diferente de lo que pueden tener en otras regiones. Eso es un desafío que nosotros deberíamos de considerar y entender que o seguimos por esa línea y seguimos teniendo cadenas globales de valor, en el caso de servicios y manufacturas, muy dado y muy dinamizado por las empresas externas de capital extranjero, o por el contrario, empezamos a trabajar en espacios dinamizados por cadenas de valor locales con empresas de capital doméstico que permitan generar, como lo ha hecho gran cantidad de países de la ASEAN, ¿verdad?, de asegurar por lo menos un porcentaje mayor al 60 o 70% de esta producción, de estas cadenas de valor, no solo en servicios, sino en una gran cantidad de actividades productivas industriales, ¿verdad?, del sector secundario y terciario, y que permita necesariamente incluir a estas empresas de capital local dentro de estas dinámicas de las cadenas globales de valor. El desafío más grande para la región centroamericana y para un país como Costa Rica es cómo lograr integrar al 98% del parque empresarial de las micro, pequeñas y medianas empresas dentro de esta dinámica. Ya vimos que hay muy poca de este parque empresarial incluidas en esas dinámicas, y pues obviamente hay un gran desafío. Uno de los retos que yo quisiera y que he estado siempre tratando de ver cómo logramos hacer esto es que por medio de estas redes podamos generar procesos de investigación que nos permitan a nosotros tener esa transferencia de tecnología de estos, digamos, bueno, como ex estudiante de la Universidad Nacional de Malasia, de UPN, pues tener necesariamente esa posibilidad de poder transferir de alguna u otra forma mecanismos que nos permitan a nosotros poder en la región centroamericana medir estas condiciones, estos escenarios, y poder generar en cierta forma material didáctico, académico, investigativo, que nos permitan a nosotros, digamos, desafiar a la política pública de los países y poder entender que estamos teniendo integración a la cadena global de valor en distintos esquemas, pero no necesariamente con empresas locales que podrían generar mayor reactivación económica, mayor desarrollo económico, mayor cantidad de empleos, mayor generación de renta para los países en momentos en que las economías centroamericanas están sufriendo muchísimo todos los problemas que ha acarreado el proceso de la pospandemia. La pospandemia y la recuperación de las economías centroamericanas va a ser lo más difícil que vamos a tener, y específicamente es porque estamos tratando de ver cómo reactivamos las economías de los países centroamericanos. Yo lo dejaría acá, no me atreví a concluir y a poner retos y desafíos, sino que más bien yo siento que el desafío va a venir a partir de la discusión que podamos tener en este foro académico y ver de qué forma podemos generar redes de investigación que nos permitan a nosotros también poder tener intercambio de buenas prácticas y de buenas, digamos, dinámicas académicas que nos permitan poder hacer en la región centroamericana un testeo de estas cadenas globales de valor y poder encarrilar y focalizar la política pública de una mejor forma. Así que muchas gracias por el espacio, profesor Ezequiel, y bueno, esa sería mi presentación.
Thank you very much, Professor Mesa. Now I'll give the floor to Professor Evelyn Devadason. I'll introduce Professor Devadason. She is a professor of the Department of Economics at the Faculty of Business and Economics of the University of Malaysia. And she's also the Vice President of the Malaysian Economic Association here. Professor Devadason, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Prof. Ramonada. Can y'all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Can you see my screen? Yeah, yeah.
Yes.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Okay.
You can. Evelyn, you may want to make it a full screen. Yeah.
Is it okay now? I've made it a full screen.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes,
thank you. Thank you. Just stop if you can't hear me because my internet has a bit of problems. Please do let me know. Firstly, I'd like to thank Prof. Ramonada for this opportunity to share my paper, which is actually written with Andrew Kam, who's the head of Center for Latin American Studies in UKM. In this paper, we're going to look at behind the border constraints because we know that today tariffs are not much of an issue in global trade, but what we have is non-tariff measures. So what are behind the border constraints? This refers to non-tariff barriers, outright barriers such as subsidies, countervailing duties, and also non-tariff measures that are protective in nature. So non-tariff measures have a public policy objective like protection of human health, environmental protection, and so on. But there could be some NTMs that embed or subtly embed a kind of protection. So these are the behind border constraints that we're going to look at. They're difficult to quantify, and how has this impacted trade potentials or trade efficiency between both blocs, ASEAN and Latin America. So just to put the paper in context, we begin by saying that cross-regional trade is growing in importance today, especially we see with the rise of global protectionism, and as when countries want to secure new and alternative markets, they want to diversify. Inter-regional trade seems to provide that particular avenue. So they want to go beyond the region and establish relationships with other blocs, not just Latin America, especially in the case of ASEAN, but also the European Union. However, when we look at one problem about inter-regional or cross-regional trade is that economic distance, geographical distance, often cited as a problem early years. Today, we are compounded with also regulatory differences, and you can see LAC and a few others, ADB and Medalla and Balboa, they have actually quoted the importance of regulatory differences between countries and how that can actually impede market access apart from the varying export structures if we actually look at Southeast Asia and Latin America. So we're quite aware that market integration between both these regions are quite low. They are not, though there are some promising avenues to engage with Latin America from the perspective of ASEAN, but it's not moving as fast as we want it to be. ASEAN, having said that, ASEAN is moving ahead with its sub-inter-regional engagement with the Pacific Alliance, as we are aware of, with the development of the new ASEAN PA work plan. Looking at past literature, whenever anyone speaks about ASEAN and LA, the focus has been largely been on East Asia. Notwithstanding, there are few studies that look at ASEAN specific, but a lot of it is on China, Japan, South Korea, especially China. So in this paper, we want to take the reference point of ASEAN with LA, but from the perspective of ASEAN, and we want to examine ASEAN's interactions with two groups, whether you call them regional groups or sub-inter-regional mechanisms, that is the Pacific Alliance and Mercosur. So we will ignore the other blocks that are existing in Latin America. Why? Because we find that Pacific Alliance and Mercosur are important sub-blocks to ASEAN. They constitute the region's major trading partner. And we'll see in a bit, the first speaker has also talked about value-added trade and global value chains. We will see the importance of these two mechanisms in their engagement with ASEAN through value-added trade and global value chains. So the key questions we seek to answer in this paper are how different are trade interactions between ASEAN PA and ASEAN Mercosur, since they are our reference point. And we want to see how do those trade efficiency scores, or rather trade potentials. When we say trade efficiency, when you trade, you have the actual trade level, and very often it falls short of the frontier or the potential trades that occur between two parties. So trade efficiency actually measures actual trade against that potential of frontier to show you how far are we from the frontier. So we want to compare this in the context of inter-regional engagement, ASEAN with Latin America and ASEAN with the sub-regional platforms of PA and Mercosur. So just to give some highlights on the literature on inter-regional trade, which we have seen, and today we'd like to term this as inter-sub-regional trade because we are looking at ASEAN's engagement with these two sub-blocks. Inter-regional trade, as we see in the literature theoretically, between distant partners, in the case of ASEAN and LA, for example, is often beset with high trade costs. Now, these trade costs go beyond transport costs. They include enforcement costs, compliance costs, information costs. Compliance costs today is a big issue because businesses find it difficult to comply with non-tariff measures, which are not standalone measures like tariffs. Non-tariff measures such as a sanitary and phytosanitary measure or a technical barrier to trade, they are compounded with procedures that surround those NTMs. So the issue may not be with the NTM itself, but the way in which these NTMs are implemented across different regions. In some regions or some countries, the NTMs could be implemented could actually be burdensome. So that's where these high trade costs come from. So ideally, an inter-regional or a region-wide FTA, ASEAN LA, would be an ideal solution, but we know that it's not practical, and therefore that is why people subscribe inter-sub-regional platforms. Why? It's a practical path towards a broader integration scheme. It's quite difficult to establish an ASEAN LA or even an ASEAN EU. We have been trying and we know it has fallen through many times. Second reason why inter-sub-regional platforms are important, it's a means or a channel for us to actually deep dive market access issues such as issues of streamlining regulations. If you talk about non-tariff measures, we need to streamline them. We can't do away with them because they are there for a legitimate reason, right? Unlike tariffs, when we actually sign an FTA, we seek to remove tariffs, but non-tariff measures cannot be removed. Non-tariff barriers, yes, you remove, but NTMs are there for a legitimate reason. So the best you could do to facilitate trade is to actually streamline those regulations. And that's where a smaller platform provides ease for such initiative. Yeah? So what we see is genesis of sub-regionalism previously within a bloc. You have ALBA, you have Mercosur, you have PA within Latin America. Within ASEAN, we have the Greater Mekong sub-region and a few other subgroups. Yeah? So we saw genesis of sub-regionalism to drive regional integration. But we see now that sort of sub-regionalism moving beyond borders to establish what we call sub-interregionalism to drive a common agenda and bring closer a select group of countries between both blocs. So this is what we are proposing in this paper, yeah, to move for ASEAN to move ahead with sub-interregionalism. To provide some context, we look at some trade patterns, recent trade patterns. The first speaker also alluded to a lot to some of these trade patterns. We examine it in the context of ASEAN's interaction with PA and Mercosur. So the left axis is your trade balance in millions and the right axis is your trade share. I will just read out the main message from this table. PA and Mercosur constituted on average for the entire period of 1990 to 2020. That's the data span. Sorry, the x-axis is missing. It's 19. Yeah, it's on top there. 1990 to 2019. Sorry. Pacific Alliance constituted 31.9% of ASEAN's total trade, while Mercosur constituted 41.5% of ASEAN's total trade with LA for the entire period of review. So both blocs constitute more than 70%. So they are important to us. But what's interesting is there's some subtle differences between our interactions with PA and Mercosur. If you can see the blue line, ASEAN ran a consistent trade surplus with the Pacific Alliance. But if you look at the orange or brownish line at the bottom, it actually had a consistent trade deficit with Mercosur. On average, Mercosur commanded 58.9% of ASEAN's imports from LA relative to only 24.5% from PA. From the export side, 37.8% of ASEAN's exports were destined to the LA were destined to PA, while only 27.7% to Mercosur. So a message that we get here, it seems to be that from the ASEAN perspective, the Pacific Alliance is more important as an export source, while Mercosur is more important to us as an import. PA is more important as an export destination, and Mercosur is more important as an import source. Yeah. Next, we look at interregional value-added exports, and here I define value-added exports. Like the first speaker, it includes foreign value-added plus domestic value-added. So I'm looking at the total value-added in ASEAN, Latin America, ASEAN PA, and ASEAN Mercosur interactions. And you can see a rise, yeah, in interregional value-added trade. Value-added exports. These are two-way flows, ASEAN to LA and LA to ASEAN. You'll see a sudden rise from 2004 onwards, and the same patterns are noted from the PA, ASEAN's interactions with PA and Mercosur. But what's the difference between ASEAN's interactions with both sub-blocs? For the entire period, again, 1990 to 2018 and 2019 in this case, on average, the PA contributed 54.7% of interregional ASEAN Latin America two-way export flows. So the Pacific Alliance plays an important role in interregional value-added trade, two ways. Yeah? That's why we look at it from the export side. So it's ASEAN to LA and LA to ASEAN, while Mercosur's contribution was much lesser at 25.8%. So having looked at this, we realized that when you want to actually estimate the trade potentials or trade efficiency between ASEAN and LA, it is worth a while to not just look at gross exports, but to also look at value-added exports, which is the summation of domestic and foreign value-added exports. The third pattern that we want to look at is PA and Mercosur's role within Latin America. That is their share of value added and their global value chain share within Latin America. So to pitch both sub-mechanisms within the context of Latin America for 1990 to 2018 and see how important they are within the Latin American region. So you will note on the left axis is your value added share, on the right axis is your global value chain share. Global value added, we define it as foreign value added plus domestic value added. Global value chain, as alluded to by the first speaker, it is actually a summation of foreign value added in your domestic production or in your exports, foreign value added in your export, sorry. So that's how much of inputs of imported inputs you use in your exports. And you are not only importing inputs, many countries export inputs to be used by third parties. So that's an indirect value added there. So participation in global value chains would mean the imported inputs and the exports of inputs used in third countries. Yeah, so the indirect value added. So if we sum that up, we'll see from the 2000 to 2018 period, on average, both blocks, yeah, the PA and Mercosur together contributed 79.4% and 82.9% of Latin America's total value added exports and GVC participation with the world. So both blocks have, both sub-mechanisms of PA and Mercosur are really important, not just in their interactions with ASEAN, but also their roles within Latin America's engagement with the world. Value-added exports and GVC participation of Pacific Alliance. If you look at Pacific Alliance, which is the green line, the GVC share of PA, and if you look at the brownish line, the green histograms, and histogram represents the value-added share of PA. And if you look at the brownish line or the orangish line, which is the value-added share of PA. So in both cases, GVC and value-added share, PA's role is more significant than Mercosur within LA. Okay, but having said that, both blocks have an important role to play even within LA from the perspective of value added and their global value chain participation. The next is the final trade pattern that I want to show is, because we want to focus on border constraints, behind the border constraints, is to compare ASEAN and Latin America and both the sub-mechanisms, Pacific Alliance and Mercosur, in terms of their import-related NTMs. Here we're not looking at export-related NTMs because we tend to import more or regulate more what comes into our country. ASEAN, basically, if you look at total, they have about 9,420 NTMs. But from the perspective of imports, it's just slightly more than 6,000 NTMs. LAC close to 10,000, but look at PA and Mercosur. Mercosur regulates its imports with NTMs more than the PA, Pacific Alliance. Approximately within the LA group, approximately 29.5% or 2,921 non-tariff measures from the import side come from Mercosur, and 26.7% of the total import-related NTMs in LA come from PA. So again, both blocks, if we sum both of that, it's close to, it's almost 50%, more than 50%. Both blocks are blocks that highly regulate their imports within the Latin America. And if you deep dive into what are the type of measures or non-tariff measures within the Pacific Alliance and Mercosur, it mirrors what ASEAN has. The dominance of technical measures. And what are technical measures? They comprise 3 chapters: sanitary and phytosanitary measures, technical barriers to trade, and pre-shipment inspection. So 66% of NTMs in Mercosur and 67.5% in the PA comprise technical measures. So from here, we get an idea the importance of behind the border measures in both blocks, as in the case of ASEAN. And therefore, we want to estimate what is the importance of these behind the border measures for ASEAN and Latin America's interregional trade engagement. Now, I'm not showing the model itself, but we have applied a stochastic frontier analysis to an augmented gravity model that takes into account total GDP, similarities in GDP between both countries to take into account tastes and differences. total FDI, similarities or similar stocks of FDI, distance, FTA, tariffs, relative factor endowments, and landlocked, dummy for landlocked and FTA. Now, it conforms, all the signs conform to what we would expect, like differences in factor endowments are driving interregional trade. But what is interesting for this paper is the FTA dummy variable. Here we looked at, there are several bilateral FTAs that have been signed because region to region wide FTAs have not been practical. Countries in ASEAN and also Latin America have engaged with us in a bilateral dimension. And we looked at those that are signed and in effect, not those that are proposed under consultation or those where negotiations have been launched. So only those that have been signed and in effect. And what we found interestingly, none of these FTAs significantly matter for interregional exports because our estimation looks at two-way export flow, so we account for total trade. Many interregional FTAs, we find, liberalize tariffs in a relatively fast manner, but they still contain temporary or permanent exclusion lists. And that's what Vignay Raja pointed out in 2013. And he gave the case of the Thailand-Peru FTA, which adopted a gradual approach to tariff liberalization, where they only committed 70% of the tariff lines to liberalization, but excluded a wide range of goods with the categories of agricultural products, fish, and durable products. So you can see this exclusion list in these FTAs, they actually have a point or bear some important ramifications in terms of market access. You can sign an FTA, but if above that you have exclusion lists, the markets are not really opening up. Second is pointed out recently by Matu and others, which also confirms that our results that FTAs do not significantly matter, the current FTAs that are signed and in effect. Many of these bilateral agreements do not include substantive commitments. And what do I mean by substantive commitments? Commitments that go beyond procedural rules, transparency, and enforcement mechanism to include specific commitments on integration and specific obligations such as harmonization of standards. Very often you find a lot of these agreements don't have dedicated chapters for technical measures, SPS and TBT. And we see they are the ones dominant, not just in ASEAN, but also PA and Mercosur. So it can be inferred from here that the current bilateral FTAs between ASEAN and LA, which are signed in effect, have not created the intended market access. If you look at the Vietnam-Chile FTA and the Malaysia-Chile FTA as calculated by Matu, it's less than 5% of the commitments that are substantive, quite unlike Singapore. Singapore signing with Panama, Peru, their FTAs are quite substantive. The commitments that are substantive are calculated more than 25%. As calculated by Matu, they are more than 25%. But most of the other FTAs, it's below 5%. So that was one of the main takeaways from our empirical estimate. Second, in terms of trade potential and trade efficiency, the efficiency scores of most of the country pairs were found to be less than 0, indicating that we are very far from the frontier. So that means that there is some space for actually engaging further with Latin America. And what was interesting when we looked at, we see when you estimate what is left is after taking into account all the determinants of interregional trade, as I mentioned, relative factor endowment, GDP, FDI, and so on, distance, and so on. What is left is multilateral resistances. We can actually equate that with behind the border measures, which cannot be quantified. And we see that behind the border measures, the constraining impact of those behind the border measures have actually grown over time between the period of our study 1990 to 2019. So we see that behind the border measures do in fact play a role in dictating this low efficiency levels or the lack of integration. And for some country pairs, they are performing closer to their frontier when we consider value-added trade. So we saw the growing importance of interregional value-added trade. So trade efficiency was found to be higher when we trade in value added than when we trade in gross exports. So what I did is, because we had a lot of country pair measures, I just looked at the average technical efficiency. I'm looking at two-way trade flows, ASEAN-Mercosur, two-way ASEAN-PA, and ASEAN-LA two-way. That means ASEAN to LA and LA to ASEAN for the 10 ASEAN countries with the 20 Latin American countries that were considered in the estimation. And one way, we can see that the technical efficiency for ASEAN-Mercosur is only marginally higher than that for ASEAN-PA, but the opposite holds when inter-regional value-added exports are considered. That means ASEAN-Mercosur's trade efficiency is much higher than that for PA. For the one-way export flows between ASEAN and the PA, those which are not notified, they are all one-way. We'll see that the technical efficiency here at 0.321 is higher for export flows from ASEAN to PA rather than PA to ASEAN, because we have seen also that PA is an important export destination for us. So the results sort of link to the trade patterns we observed earlier. The technical efficiency for one-way export flows, however, from Mercosur to ASEAN is higher than ASEAN to Mercosur. Now, all AMS recorded in general below 0.5. So anything above 0.5 is considered relatively efficient, except Mexico. Mexico was special as the trade efficiency of ASEAN partners, with the exception of Cambodia. Almost all the other 9 countries had trade efficiency scores of more than 0.5. Mexico is an established partner and also has engaged with us substantially in value-added trade. From the ASEAN side, Vietnam seems to record very high trade scores with the PA countries, namely Chile and Mexico, and with Mercosur, Brazil and Paraguay. From the LA side, when we look at one-way trade flows, high TE scores are observed mainly with Singapore. So a bit more with Malaysia and Thailand, but not so much with the other 7 remaining countries. So LA has been trading a lot with Malaysia, Singapore and Thailand, but not only trading much more, but also trading more efficiently and closer to the frontier. So in conclusion, what I would like to draw from this analysis is the level of export integration is still low from the perspective of gross exports, but slightly higher than value-added trade. So there is room and space for not just integration, but quality integration through participation in value-added chain and through global value chains. Yeah? Although we couldn't estimate global value chains because we did not have that bilateral direct dimension for indirect value-added export. And the main thing we have noted is that the deviation between the actual trade and the frontier trade is accounted for multilateral resistances, or we would like to call it behind the border effects, because they are not quantifiable. And this was found to be increasing over time. And therefore, these behind the border regulations really need to be regulated, really need to be monitored and addressed. So the implications of the study are twofold. The low levels of trade integration and efficiency suggest their unexhausted potentials. So there is space for interregional trade, but it only seems practical for ASEAN to move forward with sub-interregional cooperation with the 2 mechanisms of PA and Mercosur, but not with the entire LA, since both these subgroups display the capacity and efficiency to engage more in value-added exports and GVC trade within LA. They also show the higher efficiency levels within our interactions with ASEAN. The insignificant effects of the existing bilateral FTAs between the 2 of us, ASEAN and LA, shows us that much work needs to be done. And if indeed the results show that behind the border effects have a constraining impact on interregional integration, then something more needs to be done. It is not just signing FTAs, but making sure that future interregional FTAs have substantive commitments, address technical measures, especially sanitary and phytosanitary measures and technical and barriers to trade. So this must be accounted for substantive commitments. The second major implication is that it may be easier for ASEAN in this case to establish regulatory coherence. You can't do away with these NTMs. So we can, if the FTAs that are signed have substantive commitments, that provides a platform for regulatory coherence, and regulatory coherence seems more practical to inter-regional cooperation, ASEAN PA, ASEAN Mercosur, rather than a region-to-region wide agreement. So in that case, we forward that regionalism that existed within a bloc should move ahead beyond the borders, and we should actually move ahead with sub-inter-regionalism. So that's the key message of our paper. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Devadason. Now I will give the floor to Professor Billy Pinar-Makin. Professor Pinar-Makin is professor and researcher at the Department of International Relations of the Faculty of Humanities at Arfani University. Professor Yuliai, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Romanido. Thank you for the first and the second speakers, Professor Mesa and Evelyn. Long time no see you. All right, okay. Basically, it has been very much helpful to talk in the third session now, because I will be presenting my primary result of my research, basically on the global investment trend. Allow me to share the screen first.
Yes, you may share.
Yeah. All right. Okay, is it clear? All right. Okay, where is it? First of all, I would like to thank Ramonida for engaging me on this forum. Indeed, I was inspired by this, though I did not have a complete paper yet for this, but hopefully we can make things as expected paper to be published. My paper was on global investment trend, Latin America and Southeast Asian regions. Hopefully this is very much looking at the contemporary issues. And we know that global investment is strongly influenced by political and non-economic factors. If both presenters just not talking about trade, now it's more on investment. So the factors that influence on global investment basically can probably summarize in 4 factors. The first, when we are talking about today, ongoing trade war between the US and China, we cannot neglect it. And on environmental issues, for example, caused by climate change, and the rise of new technology that affect the landscape of economic activities, and of course, post-COVID-19 economic governance. As we understand that United States is still in the war against China due to the US accusations of a China's practice that undermine US competitiveness, such as heavily subsidized state-owned enterprises, or state capitalism, let's call it. There have been trends that shown how the multinational enterprises relocating the investment from China. This is expected to have an impact to business structure in other parts of the world, especially in Latin America and Southeast Asia, as we know that both regions are very much dependent on foreign direct investment. So this is basically the basic arguments of my paper. If you look at it, this graph, we understand that global investment trend is very slowing down. So therefore, we have to understand that various factors influence on the inflows FDI. And in fact, for pandemic, they have declining, of course, in terms of investment as well as GDP. And another important factors that we have to look in the issue of climate change, for example, which is regarded as one of the main global threats by the international community. If you look at it, for example, in terms of Probably this one is the green investment. Yeah, as we know that climate change has been becoming alarming for all communities in Southeast Asia. So the majority of the countries have achieved a clean energy economy with a long-term objective of net zero emissions, both imposing tariff on high carbon products from other countries, while at the same time offering support for green policies and reduce fossil fuel subsidies. And we indeed look at it, the Indonesian authority, like example, Financial Service Authority published roadmap of sustainable finance in Indonesia, which defines sustainable financing as effort, including financial services, to mitigate the impact of climate change, among other things. So the finance minister also began issuing green sukuk in 2018 to fund environmentally friendly project, raising 3.25 billion USD over a 2-issue period. And Indonesia needs a regulatory framework that supports its mission to attract green investment. And the experts say that as we are aware about sustainability grows among general public, this is what I can see, how the green investments becoming the potential trend in the future. And if we come back again to the slide before, we can see that the trade war between US and China is very much determining factors. As we understand how, for example, the US-China trade war has been the main reason behind the uncertainty of financial market during 2018 and 2019, which has affected the investor confidence globally. The US region, of course, the US has lost its position as manufacturing nations, taken over by the China becoming a manufacturing nations. And then if you look at it, for example, large number of jobs have gone from US, and the trade balance is on one side in China favor. Chinese always get a positive, while the US getting deficit. So therefore, the US now trying to reduce the US trade deficit with China, encouraging industries to invest in United States rather than in China. And therefore we look at, for example, US take some substitute from the Chinese import, for example. And we look at it that Latin America and Southeast Asia now is looking for the opportunities, trying to grab the opportunities given by US. And we understand that US now is moving to Mexico and in Latin America, as well as the Southeast Asia, especially Thailand, Vietnam, and in Taiwan, of course, neighboring to the China. And in terms of relocations of the investment as well from China, because many MNCs also is leaving from China due to certain considerations of the US policies. And we found out that in Southeast Asia, the productivity capacity in China moved to Southeast Asia, majority to Thailand, Malaysia, and Vietnam. Of course, some Taiwan and India, Singapore, Philippines, South Korea, and Indonesia. But in Latin America, Mexico is the most important target for the relocations of the investment from China. So looking at the contemporary issues, we found out this is very much determining factors in shifting the investments places or the inflow, the foreign direct investment. And another one also, if you look at the determinant factor of the investments trend now is more on a knowledge-based economy, especially on digital revolutions, where right now is looking the information and technology becoming instruments and the most important instrument in investment. And we understand that shifting economic into the more digital economy in the financial as well as in the real sectors has attracted investors into that particular sectors. Like, for example, e-commerce, e-banking, and other digital form of the business, for example, is more favorable, because now is looking at infrastructure that is somehow considered as innovations that what they call destroy or instabilize the ongoing models. And therefore, the threat that we are facing in the business side as well as investment is the shift of the models of the business from conventional on-site to online. And therefore, it's need to have some improvement, some technological advancement in the business sector as well as investment. Looking at the contemporary issues, some people say that COVID-19 affected the investment trend. Of course, probably in the health sectors and so forth. But majority scholars say that this does not really affect the investment trend. Of course, the investment going down due to certain policies backed by government, especially on lockdown policies and others. So in trade as well, there has been disturbed in terms of value supply chain, yeah, or the supply chains where, for example, people are becoming very much restricted in movement, and therefore the movement of goods as well is very slowed down. So this is how the trend today, for example. And looking at this investment trend, we try to understand the Latin American and Southeast Asian countries. What do they have? What they basically grabbing the opportunities, yeah, from this context. So I'm looking at both reasons. We have strengths and weaknesses. Like, for example, Latin American countries and Southeast Asian countries are almost similar in terms of the pattern of economy. They are still developing countries. Of course, as certain country in Southeast Asia, like Singapore, was considered as developed based on business and trading countries. But the rest, I think, mostly are more on manufacturing industries, and they have also natural resources, and they are proud of market size and small and medium enterprises. This is the strength basically of both regions. After I have gone as well to do the field work in almost last 5 years, we found out that they have similarities. Beside the distance that separates between these two regions, the product they have also is almost similar based on agriculture and raw materials. Of course, they are competing. But right now, by having more globalized, yeah, more on digital revolutionary base of economy, for example, this kind of similarities, the commonality of the products can be enhanced and can be really integrated so that can support the global supply chain. This is most important thing. But however, we look at it, the weaknesses. The weaknesses of both reasons are most of them still unclean technology. So they have technology, but this technology affect the environmental disasters, that affect the humans' securities problem, yeah, be it is on in agriculture sectors or in other manufacturing sectors. And also they have some weaknesses on foreign investment portfolio. Of course, the miss and ill management, corruption is also the share, yeah. And of course, all the world has been affected by climate change and lack of the infrastructure. I was in Ecuador, and with the ambassador of the Ecuador to Malaysia at that time, suggesting that probably infrastructure for trade, investment to be more active between Southeast Asia and Latin America. We have to create new way of sea lane. They are proposing from Ecuador or from Chile direct to the Pacific Oceans, yeah, without going to the what they call the other route, which is now being practiced, yeah, going to other oceans, Indian Ocean and others. Go to Pacific directly, they can save 10 days of shipping. But of course, the infrastructure need to be built on that particular things. That is the physical infrastructure that we have to really strengthen. And then if you look at the opportunities, of course, both regions have rainforest. Yeah? Green and blue economic was very much favorable in these regions. We have also alternative energy because our locations also is very much suitable to have that. And then semiconductor products, because in digitals and electronic things need to have more semiconductor products. So this is the most important product in electronic and digitals equipments. Of course, LNG, and by having relocations of manufacturing industries from China, so he's becoming an opportunity for Latin America and Southeast Asian countries to grab the replacement or relocations processes. However, the threat, if you look at it, for example, we are still reshoring and protectionism in between our countries. And there are illegal, unreported, unregulated natural resource exploitations because of the ill management, because of the weakness of the law enforcement, for example. And then we have also negative perceptions, shift perception basically toward China, from the positive to negative, or from negative to the positive toward China. In Southeast Asia, for example, they are looking, China right now is ambivalence and not becoming a good neighborhood. Earlier on, China was considered a threat or a challenge due to their own political ideological perceptions on communism and so forth. And in Latin America, of course, they have very close engagement with China. And therefore, Evelyn mentioned just now, when we are talking about Latin America in Asia, we observe that interaction and engagements are more on toward East Asia, basically China. I was in Chile and we found that so many Chinese companies established in Chile and invested in several projects, especially on infrastructures and others. So this is all that we have, for example, between the Latin American and Southeast Asian countries. But what are the opportunities now? After reading these contemporary issues, I think that we can have certain opportunities. For example, in terms of packaging, if we are not in the industry manufacturing, we have to better off our packaging strategies. So be our trading. So we can import it from any countries that manufacture the goods, for example, and repackage it and resell it. Instead of local consumption, we can also becoming an exporter for a certain product from outside the countries. Like Singapore, for example, what do? They repackage the products from Southeast Asia or from other regions to be resale to other countries in the regions. And therefore, they have a huge percentage of export and import. And we have also commodities and food and beverage, for example, agriculture-based product. The idea now is how do we enhance and improve the quality of these commodities that can be exported to other regions. Increase volume export as substitution from China. This is the idea where the United States is trying to have the substitutions from any import from China. So Latin American, as usual, have a good relation with America. They can have opportunities to grab that particular processes. And the location of US investment, for example, from China to other regions. Indeed, it's proven Mexico is the first country that benefiting from that. IT and digital economic development. I think right now, we go anywhere, the IT and digitalized economy is very much in hand now. People are going into that particular segment. And due to the pandemics, almost 2 years we have experienced it. Now it's becoming very much virtual and digital based transactions and others. Health services and clear energy system that we need to enhance. And coming into last or the latest, for example, productions, which is an autonomous vehicles and electromobility. So the vehicle based on electronic power, not on oils or gas, for example, or other power source that can destroy the environment, which of course triggering into the climate change. This is, I think, what we can see the opportunities we have in Southeast Asia as well as in Latin America, and how we do to synergize here, for example. And therefore, last, for example, from me here is the suggestions, the strategies for Latin America and Southeast Asian countries. We have to look at the capacity of the state. The state should function as helping hand. They should empower SMEs, small and medium enterprise, as well as the corporations, in order to grab the opportunity and get some investment from outside. Here is being helping hand, not grabbing hand. While grabbing hand, they get an opportunity and they just use the cronies, yeah, to work, though they are not qualified, but they just grab the opportunity for their own purposes. But helping hand, empower society, empower business is most important thing. The second, of course, we have to improve and increase intangible. Intangible is, of course, if you look at it, the what it calls the index of easy doing business, for example. Mostly on those countries in Southeast Asia are still in the middle rank, not the most trusted and easiest doing business. Yeah, like in Southeast Asia, for example, majority in the level of 50 and below, 50 and below. In Latin America as well, yeah, very rare to get the most top 10, for example. And selecting most appropriate sectors and suitable timing. Here is the most important thing. To get the opportunity, look at what is the sectors that is impossible or probably is comparable for that country, for our regions, and the suitable timing. Incentive and public policy, where the state are important here to give incentive, to give certain what they call special treatment, yeah, especially on the tax, yeah. Give the heavy tax, 7 tax, yeah, and holiday tax, so that the investment will come in. So deploying suitable business model. Currently, we are not competing in terms of product and raw materials, but we are competing in terms of model. How do we deal with them? How do we create the business model? Yeah, and then infrastructure, research and development, including human resource development. I observe that these two regions are still lacking on human resource development as well as in terms of structure. Investment tax revenue development as well need to be studied and analyzed further so that it can enhance and encourage the investors to come into the country. And finally, the diplomats who are staying in the host, for example, countries, be a commercial diplomat. Commercial diplomacy is important in order to attract the investment to our countries. I think this is what I can see. Probably it's just primary, it's not yet a final. So any further suggestion? Thank you very much. Thank you. Please.
Thank you very much, Professor Oliadi. Well, now I will introduce our final speaker of this session, as well as the final speaker of this first Latin American Caribbean Southeast Asia Academic Dialogue Forum, Professor Riza Noer Arfani. And Professor Arfani is the coordinator of the Indonesian was coordinator of the Indonesian Society for Latin America, CIPAN, of the Department of International Relations, the Faculty of Social Sciences and Political Sciences of Kacamara University, Indonesia. Currently, is the new chair of the forum that will take place eventually next year, hopefully organized and under the coordinatorship of Professor Riza. So, Professor Riza, it's quite a pleasure to finally give you the floor. Well, looking forward to hear for your lecture. Professor Riza, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Ramoneda, or I may call him Ezekiel. Thank you very much for a very warm introduction for me, including the one that relates to the next year's event. I really hope that all of us will work hand in hand, collaboratively, to make the second dialogue happening next year. Hopefully offline, yeah. Probably we do hope that that will be happening. So now let me share my screen. Can anyone see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. And I'd like to thank also for the previous three speakers. I learned a lot from Professor Mesa, also Professor Devadason, and also Professor Lily Yuliadi. In terms of topics, I think I share some of the concerns that you have been presenting, you have been conveying, especially when it comes to global value chains and how it relates to what Evelyn called as behind the border issues, something that probably I will touch upon too in my presentations. And from the perspective of countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, these issues of non-tariff barriers, such as the one that Evelyn has mentioned, SPS, trade barrier to trade, technical barriers to trade, and also pre-shipment inspection is the one that probably really need to be explored further in terms of how they affect the two regions' economic cooperation and trade relations among them. And thank you for Professor Mesa for also give us the idea that your country, Costa Rica, has been at the forefront of benefiting from the works of the mechanics of the global value chains. And I'm really glad that ASEAN is among the one that need to be carefully noticed in terms of Costa Rican strategy when it comes to global value chains. And as Professor Lily also mentioned, that probably health services or health sectors would be the one that probably need to be explored further when it comes to the Costa Rican really achieving performance in these specific areas of trade, not only in the services but also in the products, health products. That I think you've been one of the leading examples on how domestic industries participate in the global value chains and then benefited from the chains. So thank you very much for those presentations. Now let me share my thought, which is focused more on probably less optimistic one, or probably more critical one when it comes to these two regions interactions with the global economy. And I would come up with the idea that today's global economy is the one that probably reflect the concerns of the so-called post-globalized economy, whether the pandemic is something that need to be explored further, elaborate further, whether the pandemics move further the deglobalizations of the economy. Something that might also relates to what Evelyn mentions about the behind the border effects of the pandemic, whether this trend would be the one that need to be studied further. And in this sense, my presentation will be focused on. So I will have 3 parts of my presentations. The first one, I will talk about the context of the so-called post-globalized economy, along with its trajectories of the global economy, the contemporary global economy, the key features of the globalization, and how the dynamics of the globalization and deglobalization effects has been happening in the past 20 or 30 years or so. In the second part, I will try to look at specific trajectories that have been experienced by the 2 regions, Latin America and the Caribbean and the Southeast Asia, to what I call as a shared path towards globalized, deglobalized economy. And I'll talk more in terms of how the 2 regions share socio-culturally shared identity, where I will look up upon the way they relate to the notions of the global South and its relations to the global North, or in much more specific one will be the scheme of South-South cooperation, whether they have a parallelism in their ideology, in their socio-cultural dimensions, and whether the economic cooperation that we have been aspiring is somewhat that given us the opportunities, just the one that Professor Lily has mentioned earlier in his presentation. And then finally, whether the foreign relations and foreign policy scheme that comes upon these opportunities would also the one that will be supporting the idea, the aspirations of economic cooperation. And in the final part of my presentation, I will try to suggest or recommend some ways forward to develop cooperations among these 2 regions in terms of, especially in terms of development, economic development, to be exact. So let me present the first part. These are the context of the post-globalized economy. I would imagine that the trajectories is coming from our participation to the global economy, and to the one that now we have the twin phenomena of deglobalizing and deurbanizing impacts of the pandemics of the what Krugman mentioned in his work in 2008 or 2009 as depression economics. So here are the trajectories. We have the pre-globalized economy, in which I think in most Southeast Asian countries, it would be in the pre-1980s, 1990s, or in the case of Latin America, it probably was in the 18th century, where you have this practices of pre-globalized economy. Then it comes a globalized economy, in which I think Latin American countries would have the representations of the very early features of developing countries integrating themselves to the global economy. Back then in 18th and 19th century of Latin America. Most of Latin America practices during these days. But when it comes to globalized economy in much more mature one, I think 1980s, 1990s suggest, or we could consider them as the, I would call it the heyday of globalization, in which I think the effects of neoliberal institutionalism, neoliberal scheme of liberalization comes in both regions, in Southeast Asia and also in Latin America and the Caribbean. And then it comes after the 2000s, what Krugman mentioned, I mentioned earlier, the so-called return of depression economics. We have that in, especially when it comes to the advanced developed countries, the US, including to them, when they experience the very damaging effects of global financial crisis in 2008. And when it comes to that, then we have these features of globalization that really affected the way that we look at our integration as a global players, yeah, in terms of finance, in terms of market, in terms of technology. Pak Lily also mentions about this, and I think research done by Professor Mesa and Professor Devadason also really reiterate the need of us to become very aware of these three dimensions of globalization. But for the culture, the governance, the political, and its perceptual dimension, we need to really look upon it very carefully, because the impacts of such dimensions is not so tangible. It's quite intangible, as also Pak Lili mentions, and we should come up with the ideas to cooperate also in these four dimensions of culture, of governance, of political, of perception. Take take an example of, for example, the commodity sector, yeah? The one that also shared by certain countries in Southeast Asia and Latin America, i.e. the palm oil. Yeah? The palm oil industry is not only not governed in terms of its market, in terms of its technological advancement, in terms of its financial support, but also in terms of perceptions towards the environment. And this really affect the way that we need to really carefully deal with this a very delicate sector of palm oil, in which I think in the case of Southeast Asia, Malaysia and Indonesia would be the one that is very pretty much have the most interest to them. And in the case of Latin America, it would be Colombia. But these three countries has been also working globally to set up a certain arrangement that would reflect our concerns not only to the industry but also to the environmental impacts of the palm oil industry. In that sense, then we need to really engage in these perceptual dimensions of globalization, and both regions have a rich experience to do so. Not only in the perception, but also in culture, in political, and also governance. Yeah. I'll come back to that later on. But when it comes to globalization and deglobalization impacts of today's global economy, then we need to look at it as part of the tensions among its key players. The interstate relations, the transnational relations, the global local intermestic relations, the public and the private, the state and the market, in which I think Latin American colleagues, Latin American countries would also serve so many experiences, so many lessons learned when it comes to this public-private state market interaction, especially when it comes to certain key commodities. I recall, for example, the fact that the Brazilian industry in sugarcane, yeah, in the so-called the first experiment to biofuel, the to the use of biofuel. In the case of Brazil, I would see them as best practices on how their public and their private interests merge, and on how the state and the market collaborate. I think Brazilian experience should be learned of, in a very what do you call it, welcome manner by countries like Indonesia, for example, when it comes to our aspiration to also having a biofuel a sector coming from our palm oil, and so forth, and also the tensions between the formal, informal, modern, and traditional economies, the so-called dual economic model. I think many Latin American countries again would serve as an examples, very good examples on how they collaborate and they sort of like bridge these tensions between the formal and the informal economy. Recall, for example, the work by the Peruvian economist, Hernando de Soto, which come to the idea that the formality and informality of the economy should be merged together. And I think the coming of the pink tide in Latin American history later in 21st century, I think, would also serve the same enthusiasm on how to connect the informal economy, the traditional scheme of the market, to the one that is more formal and more modern. I think Southeast Asian countries should learn from them, and I think we have learned from the experience so far in the past 10 or 20 years among us in Southeast Asia. So the question is how to creatively, innovatively seek for alternatives in harmonizing and parallelizing those tensions. That's the thing that I would like to really comes to this idea of a globalized, deglobalized economy of both regions. These are the paths that we have experienced in both regions. We have in the 1980s, we come up to this idea of neoliberal ideas of how the global economy should be conducted. In the so-called TINA, there is no alternative, especially when it comes to the post-Cold War. But I think the notions of the TINA has been impacted quite severely in our case, in developing countries' case. First of all, I think the experience of Latin American countries, the tequila crisis in 1994, which comes in the midst of, I think also the euphoric movement towards global economy by the foundations of NAFTA in Mexico, US, and Canada. But at the same time, the crisis struck in 1994. And then in our case, in East Asia, in Southeast Asia, it comes 3 years later on, in 1997, when we experienced a very severe monetary crisis, which in the case of Indonesia, it's not also not only a monetary crisis, but also political ones, but also social crisis in our case. And we learned so much to that. And then finally, in 2008, as I mentioned earlier, we have this Lehman shock, which really a wake-up call for anybody, including the advanced countries, developed countries, including the US. So that I would say that what Krugman mentioned in his book, in his work as Celebration Economics, is really happening now by the coming of the COVID-19 pandemic. And we are now at this stage of the deglobalized effects of the economy. So here are some of the historical trajectories that I mentioned earlier, shared by the two regions. in the case of Latin America, I would say that political economic institutionalization has been, I think, the major features of the trajectories. You come up with democratic dynamics and its legacies, along with its disruptions. During the 1930s to 1970s. Also, we learn a lot from that. And then in the case of Latin America, I think most of the countries also have been experienced the so-called, the Huntington would call it as the third wave of democratization since 1980s, 1990s. As in the case of Southeast Asia, we have a much shorter history. We gained independence mainly during 1950s to 1970s. We have so many experience on disrupted democracy, including the one that we are now having in Myanmar, in Thailand, also for lesser extent also in our country, in Indonesia. We have also disruptions to democracy when it comes to development and industrial phenomenon that we have. So we have the question whether we have share the same road to development and globalized society since 1980s. Do we sort of like moving towards democratizations when it comes to the governance area of our development efforts? I would say probably some of the answers to that question is that yes, probably we share the same road. We even share the same socio-cultural identity, so that we could imagine that we are now at the same areas of the same ideas of global South. The same ideas of having more South-South cooperations in relations to the global North, in relations to the cooperation with the global North. We have development orientations of the economy and commercial enterprise, especially since the 1980s. We have also shared populism, militarism, or presidentialism, and the tendency to non-align. We have these political legacies. We have the values, probably also the agenda amidst the democratic encounters that we have. But also in terms of our society, we have also tends to have popular orientations of culture and social relations. We share the same idea of, for example, the same idea of having having a very flexible meanings of what, for example, in terms of identity, in terms of our understanding to time. For example, we have at the same feature of a polychronic society when it comes to time, very different from the one that coming from the Western society, which has mostly the monochronic understanding of time. In that sense, I think we have this socio-cultural shared identity, shared values, so that we could imagine ourselves to be having same notions of the global South, the South-South cooperation. And yeah.
5 minutes. 5 minutes.
Okay. So in terms of socio-cultural and ideological parallelism, we have this also. We have this share notions of political economic institutionalizations of struggles over inequality, inclinations toward populism, affinity towards popularities, siesta moments, but also in terms of legacies of the industrial system. In the case of Latin America, it would be ISI, yeah? And how the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean connect to the global economy. In the case of Indonesia, probably it's really reflect to the one that we have for the past 40 years, the so-called export industrialization, export-oriented industrialization strategies. So that's the one that really brings us to these notions of whether we have the opportunities. In my opinion, yes, we have the opportunities to have, as mentioned also by previous speakers, interregional cooperation. It could be sub-regional, like the one that Evelyn mentions, how we connect with Mercosur and Pacific Alliance. But also we have the opportunities to develop South-South cooperations, because some of us are members of G20. Some of us also, some of the Latin American countries also members of the OECD, and then also collective approach to cross-sectoral dialogue, and to come to sort of like having coming out from the middle economist trap, the one that really also the challenges that we have, and then. In terms of foreign relations, that's other schemes that I would imagine. We have dialogue partners in ASEAN, and we could expand to Latin America to do this development strategy. And then also we have this G20 OECD bridging initiative, and also we have socio-cultural diplomacy, and our effort to build this dialogue forum, also part of this socio-cultural diplomacy. And then finally, that's the one that I would envision. The first one, as I mentioned earlier, interregional development cooperation, technical cooperation in major areas of development, initiating and building epistemic communities, organic intellectuals for shared norms, values, and policies, for sustainable development, inclusive decision-making processes, popular public support, and again, this forum will connect to that. Foreign policy for socio-cultural affairs and technology, social cooperation scheme could be the alternative. And then connecting development to diplomacy, what I call as development diplomacy. I think in the case of ASEAN, we have this AUN network, and we could again expand this scheme to Latin America, for example, through this forum. Yeah? And then finally, we should set up a development cooperation strategy in its short-term, immediate, initiating Latin America, the Caribbean, Southeast Asia eminent person groups is probably the one that we need to come up with, copying from the success of APEC, for example, back then in the 1990s. And then in the medium and long term, we have to follow ups with recommendation, and I think Ezekiel and friends has drafted the recommendation from this forum. But the thing is that we need to follow them up to our senior officials, to again to the leaders summits, and we have a future Latin America and Southeast Asia dialogue scheme. So that's it, Ezekiel, from me and everyone. Thank you very much. I'll look forward to having your response to that. Thank you. I'll get back the time to Ezekiel.
Thank you very much, Professor Riza. Well, I know it's really late, we're running really short of time, we have only 10-15 minutes. So I want first of all to thank you all for this last session, for sharing with us, for watching us from live streaming YouTube, all your knowledge, your understanding, and your opinions concerning the challenges and opportunities of Latin America and Southeast Asia economic relations and economic cooperation. I don't know if there is any opinion, comments on behalf of the speakers from the others one. On my behalf, I won't make closure. I will leave that for Professor Riza, if you want to have a final word. For me, just I want to say something. I mean, this is something that came up while thinking about your presentations in general speaking. Of course, I think it's important. Generally speaking, we usually tend to focus on ASEAN Latin American or ASEAN Mercosur, but this is mainly after listening to Professor Devadason presentation. I think we should focus on also on the interregional sub-regions. I think there is a challenge because when you think about us in Latin America, you think about an organization that involves 10 countries in Southeast Asia, and then a region in Latin America is almost 33 countries. But then when you focus on ASEAN, Mercosur, ASEAN and Pacific Alliance, those are two trading blocks, two regional organizations within the sub-region. So it would be, for instance, interesting to focus on Pacific Alliance, MGMs, the Great Mekong sub-region, or Mercosur, the BIM-EGA region. I think that there will be more focus on sub-regional comparative analysis, and also the challenges, because for instance, even in ASEAN, I think GMES and BIM-EGA are sub-regional within Southeast Asia. They are, of course, they are the following, generally speaking, type of mechanism of informality consensus. That, of course, that's characteristic of Southeast Asia. In case of here in Latin America, these sub-regional groups, Pacific Alliance, Mercosur, CARICOM, they have high level of institutionalization. So usually that creates a challenge to understand sub-regional basis comparison to organizations. So I think to come up with clear understandings, sharp analysis from inter-sub-regional to regional to general relations between the actual two regions, Latin America, Southeast Asia, Latin America, East Asia, generally speaking. That's well important to feel it. And I agree with you, Professor Arfani. Eventually, the idea is for declaration to reach at least from in an independent way to the senior officials, to the ministerial level, and eventually, hopefully, to our leaders. But at least to create a mechanism to have more commitment academicians and to have our voice, our unique voice of understanding between Latin American and Southeast Asian relations. Just a comment, not a closing. I will leave that for Professor Riza.
Oh, thank you very much. This would be the closing remarks.
Yeah,
Ezekiel?
I will leave you
Okay.
for the closing remarks.
Okay.
If you want to say something.
Okay. So just a very personal request for Professor Mesa and Professor Devadason. Yeah. I'm also doing some kind of research that you're doing, but I'm doing it internally in Southeast Asia, especially Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, and the Philippines. So my request is, Mike, would you kindly please share your presentation materials to me? Okay, thank you very much, and I look forward to collaborating with you, Professor Devadason and Professor Mesa, but also Professor Lily. Yeah, Pak Lily. I really look forward to having your our collaboration of doing the research. So my closing remarks would be, again, thank you very much for the what do you call it, the confidence to allow me and Gajah Mada University to be the next coordinator for the forum for next year. I will certainly need your help, Professor Ramonade, to transitions the technicalities, the administratives of the forum, but also I really need supports from all of you, for colleagues from both regions. And thank you very much, Ezekiel, for your very hard efforts to collect these 40 members, almost 40 members of the forum. And yeah, so I will try to keep them to be in the membership, and I'll look also forward to having more members from your side, from my colleagues here from both regions. I suppose that we don't have any limitation, right, Ezekiel, in terms of numbers of members.
Not at all. I mean, the is to keep on inviting, calling, the is to keep on developing Latin American studies in Southeast Asia, Latin Southeast Asian studies in Latin America. We'll come to the time where we discuss all the technicalities. For sure, we're going to do that. No, thank you very much for your trust for Gachamala University, of all the Indonesian peers, because even though Gachamala is the coordinatorship, this is the government of the whole country, of all the university who might be interested in pursuing Latin American studies. So thank you to you, mainly Professor Riza, for taking care of the coordinatorship. For all your hard effort, I will know you will do next year. I know it.
Okay.
And the rest of you, thank you very much for trusting us, trusting me for organizing this activity. And as I mentioned before, I will just give the closing, the final good evening, good night, good morning to Professor Riza.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ezekiel. Thank you very much, everyone. Yeah, thank you. I'll see you again next time.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good night, good morning.
Thank you. Morning. Good